Cyberpunk 2077 is a game which, when boiled down, consists of three main parts, and like its main protagonist V, it's suffering from something of an identity crisis which sadly it never really resolves. The main story makes for an intriguing and often exciting romp which traipses through many popular sci-fi tropes in a creative and thoughtfully authored manner, but without ever really breaking new ground for me and fulfilling the early promise of its subject matter. And it's important to note that the main story path is probably as close as you're going to get to the cyberpunk fantasy gleaned from early trailers. Unfortunately, its sensationalism and bombast rarely cascade into the experience as a whole. I'd also argue that the first-person perspective is underutilised and is less art and more artifice for the most part. The side quests rekindle fond memories of the likes of Fallout and Skyrim, bugs and all, but never quite go far enough to fully manifest the promise of its marketed sophistication. It's often fun strategizing your infiltration into a building or base, but it doesn't feel like the game does enough to challenge you outside of a small set of obstacles and ways in which to tackle them. In fact, I kept waiting for an introduction to a more in-depth take on net running to add a new strand to the gameplay, or for the brain dance mechanic to really take on a more free-form life of its own, but sadly my imagination didn't manifest. By the end of the game, with your build at peak, it all becomes quite formulaic and repetitive. The same can be said of its RPG mechanics, which are nicely shaped but tepidly implemented. It's as if CDPR nailed the concept but ran out of road when it came to integrating them into the actual game. The perks, abilities at your disposal just aren't aggressive and different enough when it comes to individualising your build and character. My guess is that most people's playthrough will feel largely the same outside of speccing to either stealth, melee or guns. The moment-to-moment gameplay is still enjoyable, don't get me wrong, but more meaning, breadth and depth to the systems would have elevated Cyberpunk 2077 to another level in terms of its RPG leanings. Some Metroidvania-like tributaries spliced throughout the game, for example, would have done a lot to embed and reward your chosen playstyle. In my experience, toward the end of the game, there was very little payoff for my chosen build and individual spec. I was hoping that my unique cyberware choices and abilities might give me access to areas, routes, experiences that only I could have found, and in turn give me access to unique endgame gear. But disappointingly, aside from the odd room here and there that conceals some forgettable mid-level items, I'm really not convinced that my playthrough has yielded anything wholly unique from the next person's. And Night City itself, the visually spectacular open-world connective tissue, hits hard with its on-the-nose caricature of a Blade Runner-esque retro-futuristic nightmare. It's a vulgar display of hedonism, lawlessness and corporate dominion, which draws heavily on many socio-historical stereotypes. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, let's not forget it's supposed to be a distasteful sci-fi dystopia, but what it didn't do for me is ground its cultural milieu in a satisfying way as part of the organic experience. I've no doubt the many lore shards you can collect along the way do a lot to more fully bed in the social anthropology of Night City, but it's a shame that's locked away behind text dumps that can be quite burdensome on your playthrough. And without this grounding, the world just feels a bit crass and coarse for the sake of it. A sensory spectacle which too rarely explores the reasons why, which has no doubt led to its many comparisons to a skin-deep theme park. And what further compounds the Westworld vibes is the threadbare facade which is the AI. Far from being the revolutionary open-world experience teased in the early marketing promos, Night City's residents could easily be reskinned dumb bots whose resumes consist of former employment on the likes of Shenmue and Elder Scrolls Oblivion. As the initial spectacle of the city begins to wear off, save from the gorgeous ray tracing which never failed to leave me agog, you're left with a rather vacuous cityscape that has very little power to endear, failing to create a sense of warmth, charm and familiarity that normally helps to attach you to sprawling open-world games outside of a host of ridiculous bugs that you've likely seen on social media. Despite all these idiosyncrasies and incongruences, however, it is hard not to be charmed by its spectacle and at the very least the blueprint of its ambition, even if it never quite delivers on it. Beyond the disappointments, the game is without doubt an achievement of design and technical marvel. and enough in it works to provide a moment-to-moment satisfaction and overarching progression that kept me coming back for more with a contented smile. Even if part of that enthusiasm was misplaced faith in what I was hoping the game would evolve into, but never did. Whilst you're never really able to look past its many shortcomings, Cyberpunk 2077 is a capable jack-of-all-trades, despite never mastering any of them particularly well. A shame to be sure, but it's certainly not a chore to play. In summary, much like the famous Lord of the Ring line, it feels like CDPR had only a morsel of butter to spread across a colossal piece of bread, and that desperate knife has left plenty of holes along the way as it scraped to fit. The conceptual undertaking was so vast and ambitious, it feels like hardly anything got properly iterated and polished in production, and more importantly, properly integrated into the sum of its parts, which makes for an extremely uneven experience that rarely achieves its full potential in any of the aspects it flaunts. Broadly speaking, I've enjoyed my time with it, and the main line is engaging and interesting for the most part. But the RPG gameplay arc just didn't deliver the payoffs I'd hoped for and the end game I'd imagined. There is so much more depth and nuance that could have been injected into Night City to really make it magical, whilst complementing the gameplay mechanics and world building. And it does feel like the connective tissue was the last part of the project to be worked on, and got a very bare skim of finish and assimilation, which leave it glaringly wanting. The version of Cyberpunk we've received at launch feels about where the project should have been at 2/3 into its development timeline, a neat outline of the original vision, primed for further iteration, integration and balancing that could have had it rubbing shoulders with the best masterpieces gaming has to offer. Instead, we'll have to make do with a good game, not a great one, and the electric dreams of our imagination informed by the original marketing. I have a feeling CDPR's next game might be a little bit more modest in scale and size. So BArcadians, what does Cyberpunk 2077 receive as a score out of 10? I'm going to go for an 8 out of 10. A solid game that never quite achieves its true potential.
So Tabs, an interesting piece you've done there on Cyberpunk. I would say, broadly speaking, mixed feelings on it. But interestingly, I know you really like this game, so that's an interesting start.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, and it was a difficult one to review. Obviously, I've ended up giving it an 8 out of 10, which, objectively, it's a pretty good score for a game, isn't it? It tends to signpost a fairly solid experience. And it's just hard, isn't it? Without the context around it, if this game had come out of nowhere, and it was more of it'd never be an indie title, you can tell it's AAA, but if it had come out of nowhere with relatively little to no run up to it, then I would have been impressed. I would have said this is a solid game. It looks beautiful, it looks spectacular. The mainline story is super engaging and feels fresh and interesting. So in that respect, it is a good game, and I've put so many hours into it. Obviously, it has something to it, but at the same time, because of all the fanfare surrounding it, the marketing pre-launch, for years now, and the promises they made, and I've returned some of those early promo videos recently, and you really start to see how compromised and scaled back the project was. So I suppose there's a part of me, because of how passionate I am about the genre, Cyberpunk, I love Blade Runner, I've read countless sci-fi books, Neuromancer comes to mind. Because of how passionate I feel about the subject matter, and CD Projekt Red, to be honest, I followed them quite from interest for quite some time. But yeah, because of how passionate I feel, it's so disappointing to see all the missed opportunities. I'm not so bothered about the fact that, seemingly their board members have kind of pulled a bit of a con on us, or at the very least, they're guilty of some terrible leadership decisions and they've mismanaged the project. I'm not so bothered about that. Obviously, it's not good for the industry. It's more about the missed opportunities in what could have been, an absolute masterpiece.
So I think
design.
The crux of the matter with the problems with this, if you take away the fact that it's an unfinished game in many respects with all the glitches, the biggest problem with this game is how good they sort of portrayed that it would be on the promo trailers, the marketing, all the things that they promised it would be, that they literally set this up to be one of the best games of all time, certainly in this genre, and then it's fell considerably short.
Well, this is it. I mean, I was saying to you just before recording, mate, I think you could say it's closer to a linear action experience like Uncharted than it is to an actual fully fledged open world game. That's how much they've compromised and scaled back, this open world RPG that it was billed at. There's so much you can go into there. We talked about perhaps replaying the one of the original promo trailers and kind of talking through what's in it and what's not. Whether we'll do that, I'm not sure. Let us know, BArcadians, if you're interested. But suffice to say, as I mentioned there, the mainline story is where it's at. That feels like what came first, what was built around it. There's a lot of conjecture out there that when Keanu Reeves joined the game perhaps 2 years ago, they severely pivoted the experience, and that's affected things. So essentially Johnny Silverhand wasn't going to be such a big part of it, and once they landed Keanu, they had 2 years to try and make it work and install him as the centerpiece, as of course you would, because it's Keanu Reeves. But then again, at the same time, that sounds like a terrible management decision if that's what they did. But ultimately, the storyline's there. It's very engaging, as I've said. It's very interesting. Perhaps doesn't break as much new ground as you'd like, but it's still really good. The side quests around that, they evoke very much this kind of Fallout, Skyrim vibes. And again, it's very engaging to play. Where it starts to fall down is the RPG mechanics and system. I mean, the open world is just totally vacuous and empty, which is such a shame.
We've done some sort of share play through is it Parsec tabs? Is that what we used?
Yeah, Parsec is what we use. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was able to I played a bit for you, which was interesting. Did some races for you. But one of the things we noticed while playing it when we were discussing the open world is NPCs. You could be walking along, and NPC character walks past you. Well, the exact same character could be across the road. You could keep walking another 10 meters and the same character would come walk past you again. It seems like the open world is not really fully fledged in that regard. It's like they ran out of time or assets and just thought, I'll just duplicate the assets as many times as possible. And yeah, I guess that sort of takes you out of that experience of the immersion of being in the world when you see the same character walk past you multiple times.
Absolutely. I mean, they promised in some of these original promos that they were going to be, revolutionary NPC, open world NPCs. They'd have their own pathing, their own routines. You'd be able to really get a sense of this living, breathing city. And in fact, what's been delivered, as you point out there, it's barely even able to keep up the illusion. If you're just kind of walking past the scene without looking too close. As soon as you start to look closely, you can see how unpolished and unrefined it all is. We've seen loads of stuff about NPCs disappearing if you turn your back on them. Same for cars. The cars themselves, the AI is so stupid that sometimes they can't turn a corner properly, and all that happens in that case is they stop dead and they just don't do anything. And then the game seems to resolve that by resetting all the cars behind your back. It's unbelievably broken and even more outdated than the likes of Skyrim, Fallout 4, some of these older open world experiences, and that extends to many other things. That it is in many ways a complete illusion that's not held up very well, and that extends to even the story. As much as good as that is, I said it was linear because it really is. That there are things threaded throughout it that they're there to give you an illusion of choice, like different text options. And don't get me wrong, I think there are some very, very slight choices that will affect certain things. And obviously, at the end of the game, there are multiple endings. That's as far as I'll say. But the sense of choice that was promised in those early marketing and promo videos is just not there. They really, ladled it on how good and how advanced that system would be. And obviously, coming off the back of The Witcher 3, which did have a pretty good sense of choice in it, we were expecting it to at least exceed that. It's not even managed the same level of choice that The Witcher 3 managed. So yeah, suffice to say, you know, they've absolutely overpromised and underdelivered. And a couple of the big things for me, mate, just because I say I'm a big fan of the genre, you know, there's this feature in it called Brain Dance, which is essentially like a way to review other people's experiences, and then you can kind of look for clues in it. You can look for sounds, and it's a kind of a detective material they use in certain missions to really flesh it out. And it's a fantastic idea. I loved it. The problem is you're constantly waiting for that to actually, you know, really evolve. Apart from it being heavily authored in a couple of mainline missions, there's in areas you can actually pick up BDs, as they call them, brain dances. So you almost think for a minute, oh, at some point I'm going to be able to experience these BDs, perhaps as part of a mini game just for leisure. Maybe there's a secret BD that I can look for clues in that then kicks off like this whole almost secret mission. You know, that would have been a great thing to do to really give that depth and give gamers something to find in the game. It's not there. You know, there's nothing there. It's literally a great idea that I'm sure they had ambitions for, but they've just ran out of time, resource, whatever, to actually implement it. And one more thing I'll mention is the net running. So again, big fan of the genre. Neuromancer covers net running in quite a great detail, and it very vividly describes what it's all about. There was a real opportunity here to make net running much more involved. So I'm thinking, like, imagine like the Matrix, you're going into these kind of virtual environments and you're beating sub-bosses, or maybe a bit like Mirror's Edge, where you've got these kind of digitized landscapes and you're having to parkour your way across them. And essentially that would have helped to really embed how difficult net running is, to crack security systems in buildings, to hack into gangs during missions. Instead, that's become diluted to such a point that you don't need to do anything anymore. You've seen the hacking, and as cool as it is, you know, you have these little puzzles on screen, these little number puzzles. That's as far as it ever goes.
That's as complicated as it gets.
That's as complicated as it gets, yeah.
Wow.
In fact, in most cases, you can just hack people, you know, just by the press of a button. Menu pops up, select the hack. You do have to do a bit of that breaching, which is what that puzzle is all about. But essentially, yeah, there's no further involvement for that. And that's, again, another big thing. I mentioned it in the review. I'm playing this game, and yes, it's engaging, and yes, there's enough in it that's enjoyable, but there's always this promise in the back of your mind. You're always thinking, oh, I hope this kind of takes on a life of its own. I hope this evolves as I play the game. And you're hanging on to that kind of hope, even 3/4 of the way into the game, and it just doesn't fulfill on it. Which is why, towards the end of the game, you're left with this very empty feeling as you come to the realization that it's just not the game we really hoped it would be, and it was hyped up to be.
So I think that demonstrates quite well that this game is unfinished in so many areas. I mean, fancy having an item that you know is someone's memory, basically, that you can collect, but you can't do anything with. That's just nonsense.
Well, this is it, yeah. And that's borne out. You know, you said you joined on the driving missions, mate. That's another thing, for example. They've got all these cars in it, loads of cars you can buy around the city, and they encourage you to buy them. There must be over 20 of them. But those driving missions, mate, that's all you get. So those, what was it, 3-4 driving missions we had?
4, I think, yeah.
4 driving missions tops, which weren't particularly challenging, I don't think, on reflection, were they?
No, not at all.
And essentially, that is as much as you get. There aren't any kind of races that are, you know, in the likes of GTA and games like that you can just return to. There aren't even car chases because the AI isn't good enough. If you get in trouble with the law and you try to outrun, I showed you, didn't I? You get about 2 blocks down the road and the wanted level just vanishes.
Yes, I think it's really interesting. So some of the best open world games we've seen in terms of hustle and bustling cities and like environments would be Red Dead Redemption 2. Although that's less hustle and bustle, and then the latest GTA 5, I think it was. You know, I would say the open world in this game is nowhere near as good as how good GTA 5 is, and that game's 7 years old.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's Red Dead Redemption is a great one. You do, going back to that after this, I think I really would appreciate the level of detail. Like, you remember going into shops, how you could go around the shop, pick up items to buy. There's like a catalogue that's like animated as you go through it.
Yeah.
Even that, whereas in Cyberpunk, you go into a shop, there's 2 text options. What have you got? Switches to a menu, none of it's animated, and it's just a case of, buying and selling from that menu. It is extremely stripped back to the point where it's so bare bones. You can just tell that they've had these great ideas, this great concept. They've sold all that early on in the marketing, which was a very bad mistake because it's ended up they just haven't had the time, resource to achieve all this, which has to come down to project mismanagement. And I feel so bad for the developers, mate, because they must be, there's a mixture there, surely, of embarrassment, of shame, of disappointment that they've put all this time in. They've accomplished something and it's beautiful and it has a charm, but it's just not what they set out to do, clearly.
I think ultimately what we've seen is like, so this is, say, Cyberpunk 1, or should be Cyberpunk 1, and we expect there's probably going to be a Cyberpunk 2, I would think. For me, this is like Cyberpunk 0.75 or 0.5, and what we're really going to see is Cyberpunk 2 will more be like what Cyberpunk 1 should have been. That's my ultimate, I guess, hope for this game. It's just a shame that it's just a bit embarrassing for CD Projekt Red that, we know they're really good at making games. You've only got to look at some of the other games they've made that we know they're very good at making games. It's just, this seems like a significant misstep at every level.
Well, that's a great shout, that that 0.75, because it does feel like a lot of the game is in an early build. And again, it comes back to that, maybe there is some truth behind the fact Keanu joins 2 years ago. They completely have to pivot and change the mainline quest to fit him in. And in doing so, that has become their sole focus. And then they've barely had a chance to finish that within these 2 years. And therefore, everything else has been left behind. The open world experience, the RPG mechanics, integrating, balancing all of those aspects into the whole. And that's essentially what we have. We have this linear action game, which is pretty decent. And then you've got these open world elements, these RPG elements, which they feel like they're a development build that have just been bolted on and they've had to make do with it. So, that's something to say, in fact, to those people who are waiting to play it. Certainly I would advise you to wait if you're playing on last gen until they get it stable and playable and the experience isn't so burdensome. But at the same time, please don't expect that this is going to suddenly become, the game we were promised in trailers, because it needs so much work. You'd literally be overhauling, not just the open world and the RPG mechanics, but missions in themselves and side quests in and of themselves. You just couldn't do it. It is what it is, and unfortunately, it isn't what we'd hoped for. But like you say, to be more positive, let's hope this is the first rung on the ladder, and that CD Projekt Red can kick off from this and make good on a sequel. Kind of make amends.
It's really interesting that in some respects the world is so unfinished. This game probably would have been a better experience had it been like Uncharted, and it was just areas that you went to, similar to The Last of Us, where rather than, it's a story game, but it's not a truly open world game, and there could have been more effort put into the areas rather than trying to fully fledge a fully open world, and potentially that would have seen a better experience, overall more rounded product because of that. But
100%, mate. Yeah, like what they could have done, the management 2 years ago, Keanu Reeves jumps on board. One of these famous kind of yellow background announcements. They could have and should have said, if they were delivering this, and they should have had some intuition they were going to deliver something like this, if they were close enough to their business and their workflow. What they should have said is, guys, listen, we've got Keanu on board now. We're having to pivot the game. We are just going to make this more of a linear action adventure game as opposed to an open world RPG. And even just telling us that back then would have helped to have reset a lot of the expectations. I mean, obviously as well, they should have said, oh, and we're also cancelling the PS4 and Xbox One versions because there's just too much to program for. But even doing all that would have helped them out no end in terms of, you know, the goodwill that they've garnered with gamers, with the industry. But unfortunately, you know, they've just... It's almost, perhaps it's willful ignorance, at the very least, on behalf of the board, the execs at CD Projekt Red, which has ultimately then, you know, made them look so silly and, you know, hurt the developers, I would say. I mean, come on, Rich, if you've been putting 8 years of your life into this game, slaving over it, and then your bosses go and overpromise and... Well, we've all seen it. You've got to be gutted, haven't you, on a real personal level?
Yeah. I mean, you'd feel like I need to be moving on from CD Projekt Red. Because the thing is, the thing for me is the people who are working on this game, you know, the actual coders, the developers, the people on the ground making the game, you know, they will have put their heart and soul into this game. They will have spent hours and hours, and their individual parts that they've done are probably brilliant in terms of the way they are and stuff, but they've almost had to do what they've done with their hands tied behind the back, and that's the real shame. And I do feel for the people involved in this, because undoubtedly they'll be very proud of the bits of the game that they've created. It's just a shame that they weren't able or allowed or managed in a way that meant that they could, you know, fulfill the promise that this game really had.
This is it, and it will be forever compared to those early marketing promo videos. There's no doubt about it, and it's out there, and it will be out there. They can't pull that now. And literally, if you play the game and then watch those back, you can't help but feel like you've been conned. And you can sympathise with some of these investors who are trying to take them on with a class action lawsuit. But you know, I don't want to be negative and overly negative about it. But at the same time, there's justification for that because of what they've promised and what we've seen from CD Projekt Red in the past. It just feels to me like this Keanu Reeves thing happened, and then possibly as well as they've scaled up from The Witcher 3, you know, with the influx of money and success they received, they've just had severe growing pains that have really affected their ability to develop and produce, you know, games, especially one of this size and ambition. So yeah, absolutely. Ultimately, I suppose, you know, the final kind of summary for it, Rich, in a nutshell is there's a game here, there's a solid game here, there's an experience here, and it's engaging, it's interesting. However, you know, don't expect it. If you've been watching those early videos closely, it's nowhere near to what was promised. And it's going to end up disappointing you if that's what you're going into it thinking it will be. You need to scale back. It's more along the lines of a kind of a Cyberpunk style Fallout or Skyrim, and in some ways, unfortunately, it underperforms. In other ways, I might suggest the story itself, it overperforms compared to some of those games. But you know, it's certainly not much more than that. So yeah, 8 out of 10.
So I guess ultimately, closing statement would be an enjoyable game to play, worthy of your time. It's just a shame that some of the areas of the game and some of the mechanics of the game are not fully fledged enough for this to truly be the masterpiece that we were expecting from the trailers, and that is the problem with this game, I think.
Yeah, 100%. And of course, we don't want to see this happen again to anybody, you know.
No.
Mostly for the good of the developers on board, but also for gamers, for the industry. It's just been an absolute, shit show is the word, isn't it, to be honest with you?
I look at this game a little bit like, a comedy film trailer, and you watch the trailer, and the trailer looks hilarious. And then you go and watch the film, and it turns out that all of the hilarious bits from the film were in the trailer, and the rest of the film is mostly garbage.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good way of putting it, and that's exactly what those trailers did and promised. And yeah, I mean, I can only hope that they just scale things back on the next project they do. You know, you almost want them to remake this game. It's never going to happen. They won't do that, but yeah.
I think they'll use this as a basis to make Cyberpunk 2, and I hope that they'll use, you know, the next 6-7 years, whatever it takes for the Cyberpunk 2 to come out, and I hope that they take that and they deliver what Cyberpunk 1 should have been, with a truly next-gen experience that we can be like, wow, CD Projekt Red are back in the big time.
Exactly. We want to see it come full circle for everyone involved, and yeah, that's the goal, isn't it? We can
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. So we hope you've enjoyed this review of Cyberpunk and our musings, especially Tabs's. He's definitely played it and put a lot of time into this game. If you have enjoyed this little review and discussion about Cyberpunk, drop us any comments you've got, want to discuss it with us, just drop us a comment down below. Like the video, really helps us. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and become a BArcadian today. But I think that's all we've got time for. Another one for the archive.
Stamped and completed. Spot on, dude.
It's nice.